And one of the most popular items of the day for parents anyway was Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. It was something that they gave to kids who couldn't sleep or were teething. And the reason it was so popular is because it worked. Within a few minutes of giving this to a kid, they were calm and quiet, laid out. It was like a miracle. I'm sorry, did I say miracle? I meant morphine. It was morphine. Yeah, you know how in Saving Private Ryan, when the medic knew that a soldier wasn't going to make it, he would basically euthanize him by injecting a bunch of morphine into him? Yeah, it was that. For kids. I'm exaggerating. But it was morphine. Similarly, if you're a lady of the day and you're dealing with painful menstrual cramps and whatnot, the Pond's Tampon Company has just the thing for you because they dip their tampons in opium.
One enemy
belladonna
remaining.
extract. Belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, because it's poisonous. But it does cause muscles to relax, so the opium would get rid of the pain and the belladonna would cause the muscles to stop pumping. So yeah, I mean, it was almost a good idea. Actually, I'm sure it worked wonders in the short term, but for the long term, I mean,
I will kill their healer.
well, there's a reason you don't see them on the shelves today. Now, one thing that Victorian doctors were really into at the time was phrenology, which was the idea that the shape of your head determined what kind of person you were and what kind of health you had. They had maps of the human head with various areas dedicated to different personality traits, and it was thought if your skull had bumps along those spots, that it was an indicator of what kind of person you were. This was especially used to determine criminality. It was thought that they could tell by the shape of your skull whether you had inherent criminal traits, and they would actually use this to put some people in asylums. In fact, the guy who invented mugshots first started doing it as a way to sort of figure out certain facial characteristics that were common amongst criminals. The idea being that if you could figure out these common traits, then police could, arrest people before they commit crime. It was only later that they realized that it was helpful in identifying repeat offenders, so they could do it. And, as I've talked about before, body snatching was big at the time. Yet donating your body to science wasn't really a thing back then, so medical schools kind of relied on grave robbers to go and dig people out of graves on the ground. Which is why you sometimes see old graves with like iron bars around them. It wasn't to prevent vampires from coming up, or zombies as some people say. It was to keep grave robbers from getting into the grave. But perhaps the craziest health fad occurred right at the end of the Victorian age when radioactivity was discovered in 1896. They discovered what it was, but they didn't know that it caused cancer. And the way they found out that it caused cancer was because they put it in everything. They saw this natural energy coming out of rocks, so surely if you put that in your body, it would give you vim and vigor. So yeah, they put radium in makeup, thorium in toothpaste. You could take radium in pills, you could drink it in a drink called Radithor, and if you want a real kick out of it, you can drink it out of a uranium blast. Yeah, girls working with radium in factories started getting sick, the famous radium girls I've talked about before, and people that were drinking that Radithor began to notice that it was starting to eat through their jawbones, and in the case of amateur golfer Eben Byers, his jaw fell off. This is an actual guy who drank 3 bottles of Radithor a day for years. Wasn't the glow he was going for. Now this was about a decade or so after the Victorian era would officially end, but Victorians, they sacrificed a lot for beauty as well. Number 2, they did some crazy stuff to look good. Today, if you were to come home to find your lady friend standing in front of you in a corset and lace stockings and high heels, you better put that chalupa down because she's got other plans. In the Victorian age, that would have been Tuesday. Victorian women wore corsets all the time, sometimes even in their sleep, in an attempt to cinch their waist down as small as possible. Now this is still done today, don't get me wrong, there's whole communities of people that are into this kind of thing, and that's cool, do you, but the Victorians took it to extremes. They were obsessed with it. Like this is where that whole thing about women fainting because they were surprised came from, the idea being that they were
Last player standing.
It's debated still whether or not this was really a thing, but it's talked about. But yeah, to the Victorians, there was nothing more important than having a tiny waist, which they would exaggerate by throwing a bustle underneath their dress. But yeah, something else that they were really into was having a doe-eyed to go along with their ant waist. And so what they would do to create a doe-eyed look was, going back to that old belladonna, they would put belladonna juice in their eyes. But I feel the need to reiterate that belladonna is poisonous, and many women went blind doing this. They'd also apparently put lemon and orange juice in their eyes because they thought that the sting meant that it was cleaning their eyes when it was actually the acid eating away at their corneas. They also really valued pale skin. The whiter the better, because that was associated with wealth, because because if you didn't have a lot of money and you had to work, then you would probably be working outside. The sun would beat down on you and darken your skin. But if you were wealthy, you didn't have to work. You could just, sit on the couch in your living room eating bonbons with a pale ass. So soaps often promised to whiten your skin. They would use white makeup. But if you were really dedicated to that pale life, you'd eat arsenic complexion wafers. Yes, arsenic, the thing that wound up in their wallpapers I talked about in the last video, killed thousands of them. Well, they also openly consumed it in arsenic complexion wafers. The idea being that in low doses, arsenic can limit your body's ability to produce red blood cells. Like a dying cell. But less red blood cells under the skin meant paler skin. As we all know, anemia is the sexiest disease. These extreme beauty hacks are, of course, mostly aimed at women, but if you feel sorry for the women of the age right now, just wait. It gets worse. Number 3, women had it rough. Okay, so I talked a second ago about the corset craze of the Victorian era. It turns out that's actually a pretty good metaphor because women were pretty squeezed for options during that day. I'm sure it's a surprise to nobody to know that the women of the Victorian era had fewer rights than they do today, but just to give an idea of how controlled they were, consider Annette Kellerman. She was an Australian actress who got arrested in the early 1900s for going to a beach in an inappropriately revealing outfit. Oh my God, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that was, I hope this doesn't get demonetized. But seriously, women in the Victorian era were expected to be in full, talked about in the last video, killed thousands of them. Well, they also openly consumed it in arsenic complexion wafers. The idea being that in low doses, arsenic can limit your body's ability to produce red blood cells. Like a dying person. But less red blood cells under the skin meant paler skin. Because we all know. These extreme beauty hacks are, of course, mostly aimed at women, but if you feel sorry for the women of the age right now, just wait. It gets worse. Number 3, women had it rough. Okay, so I talked a second ago about the corset craze of the Victorian era. It turns out that's actually a pretty good metaphor because women were pretty squeezed for options during that day. I'm sure it's a surprise to nobody to know that the women of the Victorian era had fewer rights than they do today, but just to give an idea of how controlled they were, consider Annette Kellerman. She was an Australian actress who got arrested in the early 1900s for going to a beach in an inappropriate Oh my God, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that was, I hope that was
last player standing.
But seriously, women in the Victorian era were expected to be in full skirts and pantaloons at the beach. You could only remove the skirt when you were in waist-up water, and then you had to put it back on before you got out. And in the meantime, you just hold on to it. But in fact, many beaches provided little changing rooms on wheels that they called bathing machines, where you get in on the beach fully dressed, they'd wheel you out into the water, you would change clothes on the way, and then you could exit on the other side and swim in privacy. Which is especially funny when you consider that most of the beaches were segregated by gender. Like men weren't even allowed on the same beach as the women, whatever. But sexually, they were crazy repressed back then, both the men and the women, but especially the women. Like, sex was only supposed to be for procreation, even for married couples. You were not supposed to enjoy it. It was considered unseemly and whorish for a woman to enjoy sex, even with her husband. In fact, they believed that women couldn't have orgasms. And pretty much any kind of female unhappiness was labeled hysteria. And the doctors had a way of relieving this hysteria. It was called a pelvic massage. Again, I covered this in a previous video, but a pelvic massage was where a doctor would have a woman lay down and then he would manipulate her downstairs with his hand until she had a release of hysteria. Not an orgasm. We all know they can't have orgasms. No, it was a release of hysteria. Yeah, how bad was it for women back in the Victorian days? An orgasm was a medical procedure. How bad it was. It was also the small problem that many women back in the day were just considered property to their husbands or their fathers. In fact, men who wanted a divorce but couldn't afford a divorce had the option of selling their wives. And this was actually done at a public auction, just like livestock, and whoever it is that won this auction got to have this wife. This was now his wife, and she had no choice in the matter. This was actually documented in the Thomas Hardy novel, The Mayor of Castor Ridge. And if you're really ready to have your mind blown, this wasn't that long ago. The last reported case of this was in Leeds in 1913. There are people alive today that were around when it was legal to sell your wife. But I don't know, maybe as a way to sort of deal with that whole situation, women of Victorian days indulged in some pretty crazy fashion. There's the aforementioned corset and tiny waist craze that I was talking about, but yeah, they would also include a bustle. The bustle was a little wire floof that they would put right above their butt that would cause the dress to kind of flare out behind them. Kind of made it look like they just farted. It served other purposes. It kept the tips of the dress off the ground, and I guess depending on how you look at it, it could be seen as an act of modesty, like it's hiding their actual figure, or the exact opposite. It's supposed to be like a, you know, Victorian dump truck. But believe it or not, this was a minimized version of something that came before it. Really popular in the 1850s to 1870s, women wore these steel cages under their dresses called crinolines that flared the dress out up to 6 feet wide. It was a ridiculous fashion, and it was criticized at the time as well, but its merits are debated. Some women enjoyed wearing them because it kept their legs cooler with all the heavy material lifted off of them. It kind of created this space underneath there. That meant they could move their legs around a little easier, maybe walk around a bit more, and the white dress gave more personal space and kept the creepers off their clothing. But on the other side, they were big and bulky and put women in literal cages. But the worst thing was, say it with me, they killed a lot of people. Crinolines caught fire constantly.
Reloading.
Homes at the time were heated and lit by fireplaces and candles, and you can imagine trying to navigate around a space like that with a giant dress that flares out that wide.
Last player
Stuff over.
standing.
And the dress, by the way, was made of very flammable material. In fact, it's estimated around 3,000 women died every year.
Oops.
On a lighter note, one popular trend in the
enemy
1800s was
remaining.
for women to wear hats with birds on them. And I don't mean patterns of birds, I mean an actual dead bird. And jewelry made out of insects was popular for a while too, especially beetles. But one last thing about women in the Victorian age, they did find one other way to sort of rebel against the system and everything that was going on. And I did not see this coming before I found it when I was doing research for this, but nipple rings were popular. Yeah, they called them bosom rings, and they started in Paris and kind of made their way around as a little sneaky act of rebellion, but it was mostly popular amongst the aristocracy and the wealthier women because they knew that if somehow they got caught, they wouldn't be punished like people in the lower classes would. On that note, let's go from nipple rings to haircuts. Number 4, barbershop quartets got started for horrifying reasons. Okay, so barbershop quartets as we think of them today with the outfits and the harmonies and all that, that actually got started after the Victorian era, mostly coming from African-American slave songs and harmonies and whatnot. But the origin of a barbershop quartet did kind of get its start in the Victorian days. And the reason that this got started is amazing. So many of you may know that way back in the day, barbers were a lot more than just people who cut hair. They were kind of like the town's surgeons. In fact, they were called barber surgeons, and what separated them from doctors, doctors would, you know, determine what a disease was and offer poultices and herbs to take, you know, that kind of thing. But if anything needed to be opened up or any blood needed to come out, that's what the barber surgeon did. Steve Martin fans might remember the Saturday Night Live sketch Theodoric Barber of York. That's kind of how it was.
You know, medicine is not an exact science, but we're learning all the time. Why just 50 years ago, we would have thought your daughter's illness was brought on by demonic possession or witchcraft.
30 seconds left.
Nowadays, we know that Isabel is suffering from an imbalance of bodily humors, perhaps caused by a toad or a small dwarf living in her stomach.
Eventually, medical knowledge advanced to the point where surgeons kind of became even up into the Victorian days, barbers did things like bloodlettings and set bones being broken and even did some minor dentistry. I guess you could say they were like the doctor's office of their day, like instead of going to the emergency room, going to like an urgent care facility. But this was also, as I've talked about in a previous video, the time before anesthetic. So getting a tooth pulled or getting a bone set was an incredibly painful experience. An experience